In this video, I'm starting with chapter 5 by Mark Twain, Pudd'nhead Wilson. Initially, I'm reading from the textbook of Law and Literature, and thereafter, we'll start with the actual chapter. This chapter is about fingerprint as used in evidence. Fingerprints as an aid to identification. General note: Mark Twain's novel Pudd'nhead Wilson was first published in 1894 by American Publishing Company. Prior to this, it was published in 7 installments of the Century magazine from December 1893 to June 1894. Mark Twain had seen Siamese twins in Europe in 1892 and had been inspired to write those extraordinary twins. But the following year, he modified the story and shifted the focus from the twins to Pudd'nhead Wilson, beginning each chapter with a maxim from his calendar. Autobiographical note: Samuel Langbourne Salems, known by his pen name Mark Twain, was an American writer, humorist, publisher, travel writer, and lecturer. He has been called the father of American literature, and today he is fondly remembered as the author of 2 river novels that relate the adventures of 2 young boys on the river Mississippi: The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Mark Twain was just 12 years old when his father passed away, and the family's strained financial condition made it necessary for him to find work. He left school and took up odd jobs. For some time, he apprenticed himself to a river pilot and for 18 months took training at navigating the Mississippi's ever-changing waters. He enjoyed this profession, and as he later wrote, a river boat pilot receives good wages and is a free and unfettered human being. It was these early experiences that inspired him to write his notable classics like Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, and so many others. When his older brother began to publish a weekly paper, he contributed some articles, but he found a greater measure of success in 1862 as a feature writer for the Nevada Territorial Enterprise. It was as this paper's reporter that he began to sign his work as Mark Twain, and soon journalism and writing became his first love. About the book: Pudd'nhead Wilson is a lawyer whose reputation suffers the moment he enters the town of Dawson's Landing, Missouri, in February 1830. The first comment he makes on hearing a barking dog is, "I wish I owned half of that dog." "Why?" somebody asked. "Because I would kill my half." In that little town, the remark travels fast, and nickname Pudd'nhead, and another name for foolish fellow, sticks. He naturally gets no cases or legal matters. Therefore, he pursues his hobby of storing fingerprints of the town people on glass slates, little aware of where he is heading. Around the time that Pudd'nhead enters the town, two children are born, one to the wife of the master, Mr. Percy Driscoll, and one to his slave, Roxy. Mrs. Driscoll soon dies, and both children are brought up by Roxy. When the children are around 5 months old, lawyer Pudd'nhead takes the children's fingerprints for the first time and, as usual, keeps his records carefully as he likes to have a series of takings. Soon there is a theft in Mr. Driscoll's house, and he assembles his black servants and threatens to sell them down the river. Roxy is petrified that her child will suffer if she is sold down the river. In order to avert this catastrophe, she switches the children in order to give her son a life of freedom and privilege. This is easy as both children are nearly identical. Roxy is fair and her baby has only a fraction of black blood, only 1/32 to be exact. The two boys, Tom, Roxy's slave son before the switch, and Chambers, the white son of the master Percy Driscoll, grow up. Subsequently, the master dies, freeing Roxy from slavery, and the two boys go to live with Judge Driscoll, Percy Driscoll's childless brother. Alright, so what do we have here up till now? So let's look at the characters. One is Mrs. Driscoll. She is the wife of Master Percy Driscoll. Roxy is the slave of Mr. Percy Driscoll. Both Roxy and Mrs. Driscoll give birth to children, to baby child, to two baby boys. Both look identical up till the age of 5 months old. There is a theft in the house of Mr. Driscoll, and Roxy is petrified that she will be sold down the river where she will suffer, and her child will also suffer. So she switches the children. Roxy names her baby as Tom, and Chambers is the name of Mr. Percy Driscoll, the master. The master's baby's name is Chambers. Next, the two boys, Tom, Roxy's slave son before the switch, and Chambers, the white son of the master Percy Driscoll, grow up. So now they have switched the babies. Now Chambers is with Roxy, and Tom is with Percy Driscoll, is with the master. And now after Mr. Percy Driscoll dies, both the children go to stay with Percy Driscoll's brother, who is a judge named Judge Driscoll, Driscoll, and he does not have any children, so he keeps his brother's child with him. The Italian twins. In the meantime, two Italian twin brothers, Angel and Luigi, arrive in the town and board with Patsy Cooper. They are popular with the town people, but there is a tiff between Tom and Luigi, and later Tom makes insulting remarks about the twins to his uncle and prejudices him against the twins. Means there's a fight between Tom, who is actually Roxy's son, but now he's, because he was switched, the babies were switched, now he is acting as a Mr. Percy Driscoll's son. Now these two Italian brothers, twin brothers who had come, had a fight with Tom. Now you have to remember this, that Tom is the original son of Roxy. Tom has become a gambler and a thief over time, and in order to meet his gambling debts, he has stolen a jeweled knife encrusted with precious stones belonging to the twins. Roxy has returned and, being in financial difficulty, has told Tom to pay her a monthly allowance. She blackmails him and tells him otherwise she will let out the truth of his ancestry and his slave blood. Tom is horrified at hearing that he is actually not white. He is in a dilemma as he needs to pay his gambling debts too, as otherwise his uncle may disinherit him. The angle of a crime story. Tom now decides to rob his uncle. Disguised as a woman, he picks up the jewel-encrusted knife as a self-defense and he enters his uncle's room. The judge steers and Tom, in extreme agitation, uses the knife. The judge's cry for help is heard by the twins who are taking a walk. When they enter, the murderer has escaped and only the twins are found at the scene of the crime. Pudd'nhead's collection of fingerprints come to the rescue and he becomes a celebrity overnight. Now let's read on. At the start of the chapter, the twins are in jail. Pudd'nhead Wilson is their lawyer. As he is still unsure of his arguments, he is again going over the details of the crime. The trial is about to begin and the courthouse is crowded. Characters: Aunt Patsy Cooper. Twins are lodging with her. Mrs. Pratt, Judge Driscoll's sister. Pembroke Howard, public prosecutor. Mr. Rogers and Mr. Buckstone, residents of the town. Alright, now let's start the actual chapter. Mark Twain's Pudd'nhead Wilson. So let's go through the summary and context for the events leading up to chapter 20, The Murderer Chuckles, from Mark Twain's The Tragedy of Pudd'nhead Wilson. The story so far is, let's understand the setting and the characters. The novel is set in Dawson's Landing, a small town on Mississippi River in the antebellum South. The story revolves around switched identities, a murder mystery, and social commentary on slavery and race. Let's look at the character. First is David Pudd'nhead Wilson. His actual name was David, but the townsmen started calling him Pudd'nhead Wilson. Wilson is a lawyer and amateur fingerprint expert. His hobby and intelligence are mocked by the townsfolk, who dub him Pudd'nhead early in his career after misinterpreting a clever comment he made. Despite this, his fingerprinting habit will later become pivotal. Second is Roxy. Roxy is a slave who is only 1/16th black and visually indistinguishable from a white person. She switches her son, Chambers, with the white son of her master, Tom Driscoll, to save her child from slavery. Tom Driscoll, formerly Chambers, raised as a spoiled, entitled white heir, Tom grows up cruel and irresponsible. The real Tom Driscoll, raised as the slave Chambers, grows up humble and obedient. Fourth, Luigi and Angelo Capello, the twins. The Italian twins are foreign visitors to the town. They are initially admired for their exoticness, but become embroiled in scandal and suspicion after the murder of Judge Driscoll. Let's look at the key events before chapter 20. The switch and the consequences. Roxy switches the infants, setting the stage for the conflict of identity and morality. The fake Tom, raised in privilege, becomes morally bankrupt, while the real Tom lives a slave. Pudd'nhead's calendar and fingerprints. Wilson's collection of fingerprints, though initially dismissed as a quirky hobby, quietly gathers crucial evidence throughout the novel. Tom's crimes. Tom, deep in debt from gambling, resorts to theft and fraud. He steals from his uncle, Judge Driscoll, and ultimately murders him in a fit of desperation and panic. The murder is pinned on the Capello twins as Tom plants evidence to frame them. Despite Wilson taking the twins' case as their defense lawyer, the circumstantial evidence against them appears insurmountable. The community has turned against the twins, and Wilson struggles to find the missing link to expose the true murderer. The trial begins with public sentiment against the twins. Judge Driscoll's murder has shocked the town, and the prosecutor, Pembroke Howard, lays out a compelling case of revenge and cowardice. The evidence, though circumstantial, appears damning. Meanwhile, Roxy, now freed and financially supported by Tom, watches the trial with seething hatred for the twins, believing them to be the killers. Wilson's reputation is on the line as he fights against overwhelming odds to prove the innocence of his clients. This context sets the stage for the dramatic revelation and courtroom maneuvers in the subsequent chapters as Pudd'nhead Wilson's skill with fingerprints come into play. Now let's begin with chapter 20. The murderer chuckles. Even the clearest and most perfect circumstantial evidence is likely to be at fault, after all, and therefore ought to be received with great caution. Take the case of any pencil sharpened by any woman. If you have witnesses, you'll find she did it with a knife. But if you take simply the aspect of the pencil, you will say she did it with her teeth. Pudd'nhead Wilson's calendar. The weeks dragged along. No friend visiting the jailed twins, but their counsel, and Aunt Patsy Cooper. And the day of trial came at last. The heaviest day in Wilson's life. For with all his tireless diligence, he had discovered no sign or trace of the missing Confederate. Confederate was the term he had long ago privately accepted for that person, not as being unquestionably the right term, but as being at least possibly the right one, though he was never able to understand why the twins did not vanish and escape as the Confederate had done, instead of remaining by the murdered man and getting caught there. The courthouse was crowded, of course, and would remain so to the finish, for not only in the town itself, but in the country for miles around, the trial was one topic of conversation among the people. Mrs. Pratt, in deep mourning, and Tom, with a weed on his hat, had seats near Pembroke Howard, the public prosecutor, and back of them sat a great array of friends of the family. The twins had but one friend present to keep their counsel in countenance, their poor old sorrowing landlady. She sat near Wilson and looked her friendliest. In the nigger corner sat Chambers, also Roxy, with good clothes on, and her bill of sale in her pocket. It was her most precious possession, and she never parted with it, day or night. Tom had allowed her $35 a month ever since he came into his property, and had said that he and she ought to be grateful to the twins for making them rich, but had roused such a temper in her by this speech that he did not repeat the argument afterwards. She said the old judge had treated her child 1,000 times better than he deserved, and had never done her an unkindness in his life. So she hated these outlandish devils for killing him, and shouldn't ever sleep satisfied till she saw them hanged for it. She was here to watch the trial now, and was going to lift up just one hooray over it if the county judge put her in jail a year for it. She gave her turbaned head a toss and said, "When that verdict comes, I's going to lift that roof now, I tell you." Pembroke Howard briefly sketched the state's case. He is the public prosecutor. He said he would show by a chain of circumstantial evidence, without break or fault in it anywhere, that the principal prisoner at the bar committed the murder, that the motive was partly revenge and partly a desire to take his own life out of jeopardy, and that his brother, by his presence, was a consenting accessory to the crime, a crime which was the basest known to the calendar of human misdeeds, assassination, that it was conceived by the blackest of hearts and consummated by the cowardliest of hands, a crime which had broken a loving sister's heart, blighted the happiness of a young nephew who was as dear as a son, brought inconsolable grief to many friends and sorrow and loss to the whole community. The utmost penalty of the outraged law would be exacted, and upon the accused, now present at the bar, that penalty would unquestionably be executed. He would reserve further remark until his closing speech. He was strongly moved, and so also was the whole house. Mrs. Pratt and several other women were weeping when he sat down, and many an eye that was full of hate was riveted upon the unhappy prisoners. Witness after witness was called by the state and questioned at length, but the cross questioning was brief. Wilson knew they could furnish nothing valuable for his side. People were sorry for Pudd'nhead. His budding career would get hurt by this trial. Several witnesses swore they heard Judge Driscoll say in his public speech that the twins would be able to find their lost knife again when they needed it to assassinate somebody with. This was not news, but now it was seen to have been sorrowfully prophetic, and a profound sensation queered through the hushed courtroom when those dismal words were repeated. The public prosecutor rose and said that it was within his knowledge, through a conversation held with Judge Driscoll on the last day of his life, that counsel for the defense had brought him a challenge from the person charged at this bar with murder. that he had refused to fight with a confessed assassin, that is, on the field of honor, but had added significantly that he would be ready for him elsewhere. Presumably, the person here charged with murder was warned that he must kill or be killed the first time he should meet Judge Driscoll. If counsel for the defense choose to let the statement stand so, he would not call him to the witness stand. Mr. Wilson said he would offer no denial. No denial. Murmurs in the house. It is getting worse and worse for Wilson's case. Mrs. Pratt testified that she heard no outcry and did not know what woke her up unless it was the sound of rapid footsteps approaching the front door. She jumped up and ran out in the hall just as she was and heard the footsteps flying up the front steps and then following behind her as she ran to the sitting room. There she found the accused standing over her murdered brother. Here she broke down and sobbed. Sensation in the court. Resuming, she said, the persons entering behind her were Mr. Rogers and Mr. Buckstone. Cross-examined by Wilson, she said, the twins proclaimed their innocence, declared that they had been taking a walk and had hurried to the house in response to a cry for help which was so loud and strong that they had heard it at a considerable distance, that they begged her and the gentleman just mentioned to examine their hands and clothes, which was done and no blood stains found. Confirmatory evidence followed from Rogers and Buckstone. The finding of the knife was verified. The advertisement minutely describing it and offering a reward for it was put in evidence, and its exact correspondence with that description proved. Then followed a few minor details, and the case for the state was closed. Wilson said that he had three witnesses: the Mrs. Clarkson, who would testify that they met a veiled young woman leaving Judge Driscoll's premises by the back gate a few minutes after the cries for help were heard, and that their evidence, taken with certain circumstantial evidence which he would call the court's attention to, would in his opinion convince the court that there was still one person concerned in this crime who had not yet been found, and also that a stay of proceedings ought to be granted in justice to his clients until that person should be discovered. As it was late, he would ask leave to defer the examination of his three witnesses until the next morning. The crowd poured out of the place and went flocking away in excited groups and couples, talking the events of the session over with vivacity and consuming interest, and everybody seemed to have had a satisfactory and enjoyable day except the accused, their counsel, and their old lady friend. There was no cheer among these and no substantial hope. In parting with the twins, Aunt Patsy did attempt a good night with a gay pretense of hope and cheer in it, but broke down without finishing. Absolutely secure as Tom considered himself to be, the opening solemnities of the trial had nevertheless oppressed him with a vague uneasiness, his being a nature sensitive to even the smallest alarms. But from the moment that the poverty and weakness of Wilson's case lay exposed to the court, he was comfortable once more, even jubilant. He left the courtroom sarcastically sorry for Wilson. The Clarksons met an unknown woman in the back lane. He said to himself, that is his case. I will give him a century to find her in. A couple of them if he likes. A woman who doesn't exist any longer, and the clothes that gave her sex burnt up, and the ashes thrown away. Oh, certainly he will find her easy enough. This reflection set him to admiring, for the hundredth time, the shrewd ingenuities by which he had insured himself against detection, more against even suspicion. Nearly always in cases like this, there is some little detail or other overlooked, some wee little track or trace left behind, and detection follows. But here, there is not even the faintest suggestion of a trace left, no more than a bird leaves when it flies through the air. Yes, through the night, you may say. The man that can track a bird through the air in the dark and find the bird and find that bird is the man to track me out and find the judge's assassin. No other need apply. And that is the job that has been laid out for poor Pudd'nhead Wilson, of all people in the world. Lord, it will be pathetically funny to see him grubbing and groping after that woman that don't exist and the right person sitting under his very nose all the time. The more he thought the situation over, the more the humor of it struck him. Finally he said, I will never let him hear the last of that woman. Every time I catch him in company to his dying day, I'll ask him in the gulliness, in the guileless, affectionate way that used to gravel him so when I inquired how his unborn law business was coming along. Got on her track yet, hey Pudd'nhead? He wanted to laugh, but that would not have answered. There were people about, and he was mourning for his uncle. He made up his mind that it would be a good entertainment to look in on Wilson that night and watch him worry over his barren law case and goad him with an exasperating word or two of sympathy and commiseration now and then. Wilson wanted no supper. He had no appetite. He got out all the fingerprints of girls and women in his collection of records and pored gloomily over them an hour or more, trying to convince himself that that troublesome girl's marks were there somewhere and had been overlooked. But it was not so. He drew back his chair, clasped his hands over his head, and gave himself up to dull and arid musings. Tom Driscoll dropped in an hour after dark and said with a pleasant laugh as he took a seat, Hello, we have gone back to the amusements of our days of neglect and obscurity for consolation, have we? And he took up one of the glass strips and held it against the light to inspect it. Come, cheer up, old man. There is no use in losing your grip and going back to this child's play merely because this big sunspot is drifting across your shiny new disk. It will pass and you will be all right again. And he laid the glass down. Did you think you could win always? Oh no, said Wilson with a sigh. I didn't expect that, but I can't believe Luigi killed your uncle, and I feel very sorry for him. It makes me blue, and you would feel as I do, Tom, if you were not prejudiced against those young fellows. I don't know about that. And Tom's countenance darkened, for his memory reverted to his kicking. I owe them no goodwill, considering the brunette's one's treatment of me that night. Prejudice or no prejudice, Pudd'nhead, I don't like them, and when they get their deserts, you are not going to find me sitting on the mourner's bench. He took up another strip of glass and exclaimed, Why, here is old Roxy's label. Are you going to ornament the royal palaces with nigger paw marks too? By the date here, I was 7 months old when this was done, and she was nursing me and her little nigger cub. There's a line straight across her thumbprint. How come that? How comes that? And Tom held out the piece of glass to Wilson. That is common, said the bored man wearily. Scar of a cut or a scratch usually. And he took the strip of glass indifferently and raised it towards the lamp. All the blood sunk suddenly out of his face. His hand quaked, and he gazed at the polished surface before him with a glassy stare of a corpse. Great heavens! What's the matter with you, Wilson? Are you going to faint? Tom sprang for a glass of water and offered it, but Wilson shrank, shuddering from him, and said, "No, no, take it away." His breast was rising and falling, and he moved his head about in a dull and wondering way, like a person who had been stunned. Presently he said, "I shall feel better when I get to bed. I have been overwrought today, yes, and overworked for many days. Then I will leave you and let you to get to your rest. Good night, old man." But as Tom went out, he couldn't deny himself a small parting jibe. "Don't take it so hard. A body can't win every time. You'll hang somebody yet." Wilson muttered to himself, "It is no lie to say I'm sorry I have to begin with you, miserable dog though you are." He braced himself up with a glass of cold whisky and went to work again. He did not compare the new finger marks unintentionally left by Tom a few minutes before on Roxy's glass with the tracings of marks left on the knife handle, there being no need for that for his trained eye, but busied himself with another matter, muttering from time to time, "Idiot that I was! Nothing but a girl would do me. A man in girl's clothes never occurred to me." First, he hunted out the plate containing the fingerprints made by Tom when he was 12 years old and laid it by itself. Then he brought forth the marks made by Tom's baby fingers when he was suckling of 7 months, and placed these two plates with the one containing this subject's newly unearthed and unconsciously made record. "Now the series is complete," he said with satisfaction. "Now the series is complete," he said with satisfaction, and sat down to inspect these things and enjoy them. But his enjoyment was brief. He stared a considerable time at the three strips and seemed stupefied with astonishment. At last he put them down and said, "I can't make it out at all. Hang it, the babies don't tally with the others." He walked the floor for half an hour, puzzling over his enigma. Then he hunted out two other glass plates. He sat down and puzzled over these things a good while, but kept muttering, "It's no use. I can't understand it. They don't tally right, and yet I'll swear the names and dates are right, and so of course they ought to tally. I never labelled one of these carelessly in my life. There is a most extraordinary mystery here." He was tired out now, and his brains were beginning to clog. He said he would sleep himself fresh, and then see what he could do with this riddle. He slept through a troubled and unrestful hour. Then unconsciousness began to shred away, and presently he rose drowsily to a sitting posture. Now, what was that dream? He said, trying to recall it. What was that dream? It seemed to unravel that puzzle. He landed in the middle of the floor at a bound, without finishing the sentence, and ran and turned up his light and seized his records. He took a single swift glance at them and cried out, "It's so! Heavens, what a revelation! And for 23 years no man has ever suspected it." Chapter 21. Doom. He is useless on top of the ground. He ought to be under it, inspiring the cabbages. Pudd'nhead Wilson's calendar. April 1st. This is the day upon which we are reminded of what we are on the other 364. Pudd'nhead Wilson's calendar. Wilson put on enough clothes for business purposes and went to work under a high pressure of steam. He was awake all over. All sense of weariness had been swept away by the invigorating refreshment of the great and hopeful discovery which he had made. He made fine and accurate reproductions of a number of his records, and then enlarged them on a scale of 10 to 1 with his pantograph. He did this pantograph enlargements on sheets of white cardboard and made each individual line of bewildering maze of whorls and curves or loops which constituted the pattern of a record stand out bold and black by reinforcing it with ink. To the untrained eye, the collection of delicate originals made by the human finger on the glass plates looked about alike, but when enlarged 10 times, they resembled the markings of a block of wood that has been sawed across the grain, and the dullest eye could detect at a glance, and at a distance of many feet, that no two of the patterns were alike. When Wilson had at last finished his tedious and difficult work, he arranged its results according to a plan in which a progressive order and sequence was a principal feature. Then he added to the batch several pantograph enlargements which he had made from time to time in bygone years. The night was spent and the day well advanced now. By the time he had snatched a trifle of breakfast, it was 9 o'clock, and the court was ready to begin its sitting. He was in his place 12 minutes later with his records. Tom Driscoll caught a slight glimpse of the records and nudged his nearest friend and said, with a wink, "Pudd'nhead's got a rare eye to business. Thinks that as long as he can't win his case, it's at least a noble good chance to advertise his palace window decorations without any expense." Wilson was informed that his witnesses had been delayed, but would arrive presently. But he rose and said he should probably not have occasion to make use of their testimony. An amused murmur ran through the room. "It's a clean back down. He gives up without hitting a lick." Wilson continued, "I have other testimony, and better." This compelled interest and evoked murmurs of surprise that had a detectable ingredient of disappointment in them. If I seem to be springing this evidence upon the court, I offer as my justification for this that I did not discover its existence until late last night, and have been engaged in examining and classifying it ever since, until half an hour ago. I shall offer it presently, but first I wish to say a few preliminary words. May it please the court. The claim given the front place, the claim most persistently urged, the claim most strenuously, and I may even say aggressively and defiantly insisted upon by the prosecution is this: that the person whose hand left the blood stained fingerprints upon the handle of the Indian knife is the person who committed the murder. Wilson paused during several moments to give impressiveness to what he was about to say, and then added tranquilly, "We grant that claim." It was an electrical surprise. No one was prepared for such an admission. A buzz of astonishment rose on all sides, and people were heard to intimate that the overworked lawyer had lost his mind. Even the veteran judge, accustomed as he was to legal ambushes and masked batteries in criminal procedure, was not sure that his ears were not deceiving him, and asked counsel what it was he had said. Howard's impassive face betrayed no sign, but his attitude and bearing lost something of their careless confidence for a moment. Wilson resumed. "We not only grant that claim, but we welcome it and strongly endorse it. Leaving that matter for the present, we will now proceed to consider other points in the case which we propose to establish by evidence, and shall include that one in the chain in its proper place." He had made up his mind to try a few hardy guesses in mapping out his theory of the origin and motive of the murder, guesses designed to fill up gaps in it, guesses which would help if they hit and would probably do no harm if they didn't. To my mind, certain circumstances of the case before the court seem to suggest a motive for the homicide quite different from the one insisted on by the state. It is my conviction that the motive was not revenge, but robbery. It has been urged that the presence of the accused brothers in that fatal room, just after notification that one of them must take the life of Judge Driscoll or lose his own the moment the parties should meet, clearly signifies that the natural instinct of self-preservation moved my clients to go there secretly and save Count Luigi by destroying his adversary. Then why did they stay there after the deed was done? Mrs. Pratt had time, although she did not hear the cry for help, but woke up some moments later to run to that room, and there she found these men standing and making no effort to escape. If they were guilty, they ought to have been running out of the house at the same time that she was running to that room. If they had had such a strong instinct toward self-preservation as to move them to kill that unarmed man, what had become of it now, when it should have been more alert than ever? Would any of us have remained there? Let us not slander our intelligence to that degree. Much stress has been laid upon the fact that the accused offered a very large reward for the knife with which this murder was done. That no thief came forward to claim that extraordinary reward. That the later fact was good circumstantial evidence. That the claim that the knife had been stolen was a vanity and a fraud. That these details, taken in connection with the memorable and apparently prophetic speech of the deceased concerning that knife, and the final discovery of that very knife in the fatal room where no living person was found present with the slaughtered man but the owner of the knife and his brother, form an indestructible chain of evidence which fixes the crime upon those unfortunate strangers. But I shall presently ask to be sworn, and shall testify that there was a large reward offered for the thief also, and it was offered secretly and not advertised, that this fact was indiscreetly mentioned, or at least tactically admitted in what was supposed to be safe circumstances, but may not have been. The thief may have been present himself. Tom Driscoll had been looking at the speaker, but dropped his eyes at this point. In that case, he would retain the knife in his possession, not daring to offer it for sale or for pledge in a pawn shop. There was a nodding of heads among the audience by way of admission that this was not a bad stroke. I shall prove to the satisfaction of the jury that there was a person in Judge Driscoll's room several minutes before the accused entered it. This produced a strong sensation. The last drowsy head in the courtroom roused up now and made preparation to listen. If it shall seem necessary, I will prove by the Mrs. Clarkson that they met a veiled person, ostensibly a woman, coming out of the back gate a few minutes after the cry for help was heard. This person was not a woman, but a man dressed in woman's clothes. Another sensation. Wilson had his eye on Tom when he hazarded this guess, to see what effect it would produce. He was satisfied with the result, and said to himself, "It was a success. He is hit." The object of that person in that house was robbery, not murder. It is true that the safe was not open, but there was an ordinary tin cash box on the table with $3,000 in it. It is easily supposable that the thief was concealed in the house, that he knew of this box and of its owner's habit of counting its contents and arranging his accounts at night. If he had that habit, which I do not assert of course, that he tried to take the box while its owner slept, but made a noise and was seized, and had to use the knife to save himself from capture, and that he fled without his booty because he heard help coming. I have now done with my theory, and will proceed to the evidences by which I propose to try to prove its soundness. Wilson took up several of his strips of glass. When the audience recognized these familiar mementos of Pudd'nhead's old-time childish puttering and folly, the tense and funereal interest vanished out of their faces, and the house burst into volleys of relieving and refreshing laughter. And Tom chirked up and joined in the fun himself. But Wilson was apparently not disturbed. He arranged his records on the table before him and said, "I beg the indulgence of the court while I make a few remarks in explanation of some evidence which I am about to introduce, and which I shall presently ask to be allowed to verify under oath on the witness stand. Every human being carries with him from his cradle to his grave certain physical marks which do not change their character, and by which he can always be identified, and that without shade of doubt or question. These marks are his signature, his psychological autograph, so to speak, and this autograph cannot be counterfeited, nor can he disguise it or hide it away, nor can it become illegible by the wear and mutations of time. The signature is not his face. Age can change that beyond recognition. It is not his hair, for that can fall out, and it is not his height, for duplicates of that exist. It is not his form, for duplicates of that exist also, whereas this signature is each man's very own. There is no duplicate of it among the swarming populations of the globe. The audience were interested once more. This autograph consists of delicate lines or corrugations with which nature marks the insides of the hands and the soles of the feet. If you will look at the balls of your fingers, you that have a very sharp eyesight, you will observe that these dainty curving lines lie close together, like those that indicate the borders of oceans in maps, and that they form a various clearly defined patterns, such as arches, circles, long curves, volts, etc., and that these patterns differ on the different fingers. Every man in the room had his hand up to the light now, and his head canted to one side, and was minutely scrutinizing the balls of his fingers. There were whispered ejaculations of "Why, it's so? I never noticed that before." The patterns on the right hand were not the same as those on the left. Ejaculations of "Why, that's so too." Taken finger for finger, your patterns differ from your neighbors. Comparisons were made all over the house. Even the judge and jury were absorbed in this curious work. The patterns of a twin's right hand are not the same as those on his left. One twin's patterns are never the same as his fellow twin's patterns. The jury will find that the patterns upon the finger balls of the accused follow this rule. An examination of the twins' hands was begun at once. You have often heard of twins who were so exactly alike that when dressed alike, their own parents could not tell them apart. Yet there was never a twin born into this world that did not carry from birth to death a sure identifier in this mysterious and marvelous natal autograph. That once known to you, his fellow twin could never personate him and deceive him. Wilson stopped and stood silent. Inattention dies a quick and sure death when a speaker does that. The stillness gives warning that something is coming. All palms and finger balls went down now. All slouching forms straightened. All heads came up. All eyes were fastened upon Wilson's face. He waited yet 1, 2, 3 moments to let his pause complete and perfect its spell upon the house. Then, when through the profound hush he could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall, he put out his hand and took the Indian knife by the blade and held it aloft where all could see the sinister spots upon its ivory handle. Then he said, in a level and passionless voice, "Upon this heft stands the assassin's natal autograph, written in the blood of that helpless and unoffending old man who loved you and whom you all loved. There is but one man in the whole earth whose hand can duplicate that crimson sign." He paused and raised his eyes to the pendulum swinging back and forth. "And please, God, we will produce that man in this room before the clock strikes noon." Stunned, distraught, unconscious of its own movement, the house half rose as if expecting to see the murderer appear at the door, and a breeze of muttered ejaculations swept the place. "Order in the court! Sit down!" This from the sheriff. He was obeyed, and quiet reigned again. Wilson stole a glance at Tom and said to himself, He is flying signals of distress. Now, even people who despise him are pitying him. They think this is a hard ordeal for a young fellow who has lost his benefactor by so cruel a stroke. And they are right. He resumed his speech. For more than 20 years, I have amused my compulsory leisure with collecting these curious physical signatures in this town. At my house, I have hundreds upon hundreds of them. Each and every one is labeled with name and date, not labeled the next day or even the next hour, but in the very minute that the impression was taken. When I go upon the witness stand, I will repeat under oath the things which I am now saying. I have the fingerprints of the court, the sheriff, and every member of the jury. There is hardly a person in this room, white or black, whose natal signature I cannot produce, and not one of them can so disguise himself that I cannot pick him out from a multitude of his fellow creatures and unerringly identify him by his hands. And if he and I should live to be 100, I could still do it. The interest of the audience was steadily deepening now. I have studied some of these signatures so much that I know them as well as the bank cashier knows the autograph of his oldest customer. While I turn my back now, while I turn my back now, I beg that several persons will be so good as to pass their fingerprints through their hair and then press them upon one of the panes of the window near the jury, and that among them the accused may set their finger marks. Also, I beg that these experimenters or others will set their finger marks upon another pane and add again the marks of the accused, but not placing them in the same order or relation to the other signatures as before. For by one chance in a million, a person might happen upon the right marks by pure guesswork once. Therefore, I wish to be tested twice. He turned his back, and the two panes were quickly covered with delicately lined oval spots, but visible only to such persons as could get a dark background for them, the foliage of a tree, outside for instance. Then, upon call, Wilson went to the window, made his examination, and said, "This is Count Lugi's right hand. This one, 3 signatures below, is his left. Here is Count Angelo's right. Down here is his left. Now for the other pane. Here and here are Count Lugi's. Here and here are his brothers." He faced about. "Am I right?" A deafening explosion of applause was the answer. The bench said, "This certainly approaches the miraculous." Wilson turned to the window again and remarked, pointing with his finger, "This is the signature of Mr. Justice Robinson." Applause. "This of Constable Blake." Applause. "This of John Mason, juryman." Applause. "This of the sheriff." Applause. I cannot name the others, but I have them all at home, named and dated, and could identify them all by my fingerprint records. He moved to his place through a storm of applause, which the sheriff stopped, and also made the people sit down, for they were all standing and struggling to see, of course. Court, jury, sheriff, and everybody had been too absorbed in observing Wilson's performance to attend to the audience earlier. "Now, then," said Wilson, "I have here the natal autographs of 2 children, thrown up to 10 times the natural size by the pantograph, so that anyone who can see at all can tell the markings apart at a glance. We'll call the children A and B. Here are A's finger marks, taken at the age of 5 months. Here they are again, taken at 7 months. Tom started. They are alike, you see. Here are B's at 5 months and also at 7 months. They too exactly copy each other, but the patterns are quite different from A's, you observe. I shall refer to these again presently, but we will turn them face down now. Here, thrown up 10 sizes, are the natal autographs of the two persons who are here before you, accused of murdering Judge Driscoll. I made these pentagraph copies last night, and will so swear when I go upon the witness stand. I asked the jury to compare them with the finger marks of the accused upon the window panes, and tell the court if they are the same. He passed a powerful magnifying glass to the four men. One juryman after another took the cardboard and the glass and made the comparison. Then the foreman said to the judge, "Your Honor, we are all agreed that they are identical." Wilson said to the foreman, "Please turn that cardboard face down and take this one and compare it searchingly by the magnifier with the fatal signatures upon the knife handle and report your finding to the court." Again the jury made minute examinations and again reported, "We find them to be exactly identical, Your Honor." Wilson turned down Wilson turned toward the counsel for the prosecution, and there was a clearly recognizable note of warning in his voice when he said, "May it please the court, the state has claimed, strenuously and persistently, that the blood-stained fingerprint upon that knife handle were left there by the assassin of Judge Driscoll. You have heard us grant that claim, and welcome it." He turned to the jury. "Compare the fingerprints of the accused with the fingerprints left by the assassin and report." The comparison began. As it proceeded, all movement and all sound ceased, and the deep silence of an absorbed and waiting suspense settled upon the house. And when at last the words came, "They do not even resemble," a thunder crash of applause followed, and the house sprang to its feet, but was quickly repressed by official force and brought to order again. Tom was altering his position every few minutes now, but none of his changes brought repose nor any small trifle of comfort. When the house's attention was become fixed once more, Wilson said gravely, indicating the twins with a gesture, "These men are innocent. I have no further concern with them." Another outbreak of applause began, but was promptly checked. "We will now proceed to find the guilty." Tom's eyes were starting from their sockets. Yes, it was a cruel day for the bereaved youth, everybody thought. "We'll return to the infant autographs of A and B. I'll ask the jury to take these large pantograph facsimiles of A's marked 5 months and 7 months. Do they tally?" The foreman responded, "Perfectly." "Now examine this pantograph taken at 8 months and also marked A. Does it tally with the other two?" The surprised response was, "No, they differ widely." "You are quite right. Now take these two pantographs of B's autograph, marked 5 months and 7 months. Do they tally with each other?" "Yes, perfectly." "Take this third pantograph, marked B, 8 months. Does it tally with B's other two?" "By no means." "Do you know how to account for those strange discrepancies?" "I'll tell you. For a purpose unknown to me us, for a purpose unknown to us, but probably a selfish one. Somebody changed those children in the cradle." This produced a vast sensation, naturally. Roxana Roxana was astonished at this admirable guess, but not disturbed by it. To guess the exchange was one thing, To guess who did it, quite another. Pudd'nhead Wilson could do wonderful things, no doubt, but he couldn't do impossible ones. Safe. She was perfectly safe. She smiled privately. Between the ages of 7 months and 8 months, those children were changed in the cradle. He made one of his effect collecting pauses and added, "And the person who did it is in this house." Roxy's pulses stood still. The house was thrilled as with an electric shock, and the people half rose as if to seek a glimpse of the person who had made that exchange. Tom was growing limp. The life seemed oozing out of him. Wilson resumed. Wilson resumed. A was put into B's cradle in the nursery. B was transferred to the kitchen and became a negro and a slave. Sensation, confusion of angry ejaculations. But within a quarter of an hour, he will stand before you, white and free. Burst of applause, checked by the officers. From 7 months onward until now, A has still been a superer, and in my finger record, he bears B's name. Here is his pantograph at the age of 12. Compare it with the assassin's signature upon the knife handle. Do they tally? The foreman answered, to the minutest detail. Wilson said solemnly, "The murderer of your friend and mine, York Driscoll of the generous hand and the kindly spirit, sits in among you. Valet de chambre, negro and slave, falsely called Thomas A. Becket Driscoll, make upon the window the fingerprints that will hang you." Tom turned his ashen face imploring towards the speaker, made some impotent movements with his white lips, then slid limp and lifeless to the floor. Wilson broke the awed silence with the words, "There is no need. He has confessed." Roxy flung herself upon her knees, covered her face with her hands, and out through her sobs the words struggled. "The Lord have mercy upon me, poor miserable sinner that I is." The clock struck 12. The court rose. The new prisoner, handcuffed, was removed. Conclusion. It is often the case that the man who can't tell a lie thinks he is the best judge of all. Pudd'nhead Wilson's calendar. October 12, the discovery. It was wonderful to find America, but it could have been more wonderful to miss it. Pudd'nhead Wilson's calendar. The town sat up all night to discuss the amazing events of the day and swap guesses as to when Tom's trial would begin. Troop after troop of citizens came to serenade Wilson and require a speech and shout themselves hoarse over every sentence that fell from his lips. For all his sentences were golden now. All were marvelous. His long fight against hard luck and prejudice was ended. He was a made man for good. And as each of these roaring gangs of enthusiasts marched away, some remorseful member of it was quite sure to raise his voice and say, "And this is the man the likes of us have called Pudd'nhead for more than 20 years. He has resigned from that position, friends." Yes, but it isn't vacant. We are elected. This completes the entire chapter of Pudd'nhead Wilson by Mark Twain. This is a wonderful story of how a lawyer, through his hobby of fingerprint collection, manages to free his clients of the charge of murder. The video has been quite long. Thank you very much for listening through. Take care. Bye bye.